It says that in the Wisdom of Solomon. It says that. What did they miss out in the desert that they had so much of back in Egypt? Onions, garlic, leeks. They're murmuring. It is surely significant the Bible has more warnings against murmuring than it has against murder. Which is the more serious sin? Well, let's discuss that sometime, but not this morning. What's the opposite of murmuring? What's the opposite? Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. What the Lord wants is a thankful people who bless his name for all the blessings, the grace that he pours about upon them abundantly. In all things, give thanks. You see, thanksgiving is the opposite of murmuring. How should we live? Give thanks all the time. You have two options for those of you who are going to live a long time. For those of you who are going to be martyred, then you got a different vocation. But those of you who are going to live a long time, you have two options, rather. You can grow up and grow old as a bitter person, a complaining person, somebody who's disgruntled because they've spent their whole life murmuring, or you can grow old with joy and peace because you cultivated the habit of thanksgiving. This is the month we will finally celebrate Thanksgiving, and I'm very much looking forward to that. But every day is Thanksgiving Day. Every day is the day for blessing in the name of the Lord. Amen.
Homilies from All Saints with Father Pat Reardon, pastor of All Saints Orthodox Church in Chicago and senior editor of Touchstone magazine. This has been a presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
This is Ancient Faith Today with Father Tom Soroka, a weekly live call-in show addressing the issues of our day from a distinctly Orthodox perspective. You can join the conversation by calling in at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Father Tom is the priest at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and welcomes guests from across the globe to discuss important topics of interest. Here's Father Tom.
Welcome to Ancient Faith Today. This is Father Tom Soroka, and I'm so glad that you're with us this evening. We'll be taking your calls in a bit at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Bobby will be answering your calls tonight, so please make sure to turn the show volume off before you come on air. You can also join us in the chat room, which is now open, by going to ancientfaith.com/live. Another way to connect with us is to go to facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday and place your question in the thread for tonight's show. You can also send us an email at aft@ancientfaith.com. And remember that our show is being live simulcast weekly on the AFR Facebook and YouTube pages. So let's get started. We are witnessing a pivotal moment in America and even across the world. The death of George Floyd, slowly dying at the knee of one white police officer after being arrested on suspicion of using counterfeit money, while 3 officers looked on but did not intervene, has sparked widespread outrage. His death, in the context of many other African-American deaths at the hands of police, has raised serious questions, both of police brutality and of racial profiling. The protests continue even as we record this program, some still violent, as the conversation has turned to larger questions of race relations and police reform. President Trump announced today in an executive order which bans chokeholds and requires that complaints against police officers follow them from job to job. However, all of these factors do not mitigate the reality that the vast majority of police officers, both white and black, are honest and work honorably, often under very difficult circumstances. Nor does the current controversy deny the very real problems plaguing many inner city communities, problems of widespread violent crime, drug use, a lack of desire for education, the breakdown of the nuclear family, all often fueled by rampant poverty. And so the cycle fuels itself and is seemingly impossible to be stopped. Our two outstanding guests tonight bring a unique set of skills and experiences to our discussion. Father Paul Abernathy is the CEO of Neighborhood Resilience Project, an Orthodox ministry that operates in a predominantly black, underserved community in Pittsburgh. He's a combat veteran of the Iraq War, where he learned firsthand about post-traumatic stress disorder, and he has applied these concepts in serving communities inundated with trauma for generations. Father Paul, welcome back to Ancient Faith Today.
Father Tom, so good to be with you.
Thank you for coming. And also, we have Father Raphael Barberg, pastor of St. George Antiochian Orthodox Church in Niagara Falls, New York, and formerly a 20-year veteran of the Buffalo Police Department, serving as a supervisory officer in the rank of lieutenant. He also serves frequently as a responder through the auspices of International Orthodox Christian Charities, having served at the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York City, the campus shooting at Virginia Tech, New Jersey's Superstorm Sandy, and Texas's Hurricane Harvey. Father Raphael, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Good to be here, Father Tom. Thanks for the invite.
Well, gentlemen, we have not a very light topic for our discussion tonight, but I can't think of two people that are more well-equipped to help us through this discussion. So just to get us started, gentlemen, I really would like to start. Let's let the audience know a little bit about yourselves and about your background, and maybe just briefly, because we have so much to talk about, how does it relate to today's topic? Because I just gave you a very brief introduction. Tell us how your experience helps you to understand this topic. Father Paul, tell us a little bit about yourself and what does your background help in this problem tonight?
Sure. Thank you, Father. Well, for me, just as you had mentioned, being the CEO of the Neighborhood Resilience Project, and of course, also pastoring a mission church in a predominantly black community, St. Moses, my experience comes really through the lens of community trauma. And that's really, in our ministry, our real focus has become trauma-informed community development, understanding that there has been multi-generational complex trauma that has besieged these communities for generations. And you had referenced some of that in your opening, whether we're talking about the poverty, whether we're talking about lack of opportunity or education, certainly talking about the gun violence, addiction, eviction, all of these sorts of things that really plague these communities. And so really, the perspective that I have acquired through this particular work is what really the impact of this trauma is on communities and people. Whenever we see a lot of what's happening in the streets, we think could it really be because one man was killed by a police officer? To that, I would say it's about much more than that. That there is a tremendous history of complex multi-generational trauma that has really stirred these communities, that has really created a narrative that is pouring out really in this particular time. And so that's and I would say that can be a helpful contribution to this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Father Raphael, tell us a little bit about your background and what do you bring to this conversation in terms of things that you've witnessed as a police officer?
Yeah, sure. But first, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity, and what an honor it is to be here with Father Paul, who I truly admire. If parish ministry can be the equivalent of infantry in the army or something, what he does, I think, is the special forces, and he's a great guy, and I appreciate this opportunity. But having been a cop for 20 years, and I worked most of my most of my time in patrol, either as a patrolman or a patrol supervisor, and most of that was on the Buffalo's East Side, which was a very violent place back in the 90s, in the early part of whatever that decade's called, the 00s. I saw a lot of what Father Paul was talking about. I saw the trauma that families had to live with and try to cope with and try to manage and find something tangible and good to pass on down to their children and to prepare them for the world and against crazy odds. I saw lots of heroism at the same time that I saw lots of trauma and damage and ugliness. I saw lots of beauty, and I think I am not an expert in social problems, or I have no great ideas about how to solve these issues, but I guess I do have some experience and the personal story of my own of being a white kid from the suburbs working in the inner city and wanting to make a difference and wanting to do good in the world. Right. And the world is a complicated place, or at least we make it complicated. But that's where I guess where I'm coming from. So.
Yeah, and I think the other issue that we'll eventually get to is the idea of, as lay people, that is, as non-police officers, it's very easy for us to discuss and to point out, quote unquote, police brutality. But, we may not know exactly what a police officer goes through all the time, the stresses that they are under, and maybe, I don't know, a lack of training or something like that would cause, reactions that are disproportionate to the situation. So we will get to that. All right. So here's our first question for the night. I just want to kind of step back, and we've been witnessing, 3 weeks now of protests, some very violent, most quite peaceful. But as Father Paul had said, there is a larger issue here. The issue of the experience of especially minorities and Black people as it relates to our larger society and as it relates to the police. So I know that's kind of an open-ended question, but as you were both watching these protests, Father Paul, I'll start with you. What was going through your mind when you were watching it? Were you identifying with them and saying, yes, I understand, I get it? Were you trying to see the other side? What was happening in your mind, Father Paul? Then we'll go to Father Raphael when you're watching these protests.
Yeah, well, for me, Father, I mean, my experience is kind of unique in the sense that, we work very closely with the police. And I mean, we obviously are working in the community, and we've done a lot of work to build relationships with the police in the community. It's important, I think, to note that historically relations between the African American community and police they've been challenged by really historical circumstance. I mean, it really goes back even to the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that any slave that escapes, even if they're in a northern state, they have to be captured and returned back to their owners in the South. And so police, right at that particular point, were then forced to uphold that law. I remember being in the Harriet Beecher Stowe house in Connecticut and seeing actually a snippet of newspaper from the 1850s.
Father Paul, we're not here.
There was
yet.
Oh yeah, sorry. Excuse me. There was
we got you.
Yeah, I remember seeing a news snippet from the Harriet Beecher Stowe house in Connecticut warning African Americans not to talk to the police for fear of actually being captured and sent back down south. Now, if you forward 100 years, you see that police were actually enforcing Jim Crow laws all throughout after Reconstruction, all throughout the South. And so there is this history, and there are many people in the African American community who are still alive that had actually those personal experiences of those really unjust interactions with the police. So historically, police in the African American community have not always let's say from that perspective, been in a position to uphold just and righteous laws. And that has left really a void in the community. Historically, there were also periods of history where African Americans would actually organize police among themselves to police essentially their own communities. There were militias. There were militias that actually existed and tried to enlist to fight in the Union Army. I know here in Pittsburgh, but their primary purpose was to police the African American community because there was this void. Now, I think currently how that complicates things is that really with that kind of void, if people don't feel safe, it really undermines the kind of community that you can build. And when, Father Raphael, who I deeply love and respect also, Father, when he was talking about the violence that plagues, these communities, talking about, drugs and those sorts of things that can enter the community, if people don't feel like they can really call, public safety, reliable public safety, it can be very disruptive to the ability to build and cultivate community. And
right.
So for me,
so Father Paul, let me interrupt you though, just for a second, because I want to keep focused on the, I want you to articulate for me, however, what you feel like the protesters are saying. From what I'm hearing you say, is that the protesters are saying that Black people in the inner city that, have this generational memory of being mistreated by the police don't feel safe by being policed. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, because part of the challenge is how this really still persists is that the vast majority of police officers in our city, for example, in the city of Pittsburgh, the vast majority of police officers policing Black neighborhoods are white police officers who don't come from these neighborhoods. Now, if you would imagine that the only time you interact with these police officers is in a negative interaction, that for both the community member and the police officer forms what really we call implicit bias. If the only interaction you ever have with a police officer is when they're busting down a door in the community, that really shapes your perception of police officers. If your only interaction with them is arresting someone in the community, that shapes your perception of police officers. Conversely, if the only interaction that a police officer has with African Americans is when they're arresting an African American drug dealer or an African American prostitute, or when they show up in the aftermath of African American gun violence, that can shape the perception of the police officer towards the African American as well.
But
so those are some of the challenges.
But let me, and I'm your friend, but I want to push back here a little bit and say, how is a white person's interaction with police different other than, maybe in the neighborhood there's not as many violent crimes, but generally speaking, all of our encounters with police generally are uncomfortable, whether we're getting stopped for speeding or whether we're being arrested for drunkenness or disorderly conduct or whatever it is. I personally don't recall ever having a sort of a pleasant experience with the police. That's kind of the nature of the relationship, is it not?
Well, I think that there are certainly some very powerful exceptions. And just to go in our own city, there's two that I would offer that happened in the same year. And that is, of course, Antoine Rose, who was a 17-year-old, as you know, African-American boy who was shot in the back 3 times and killed by an East Pittsburgh police officer. Now, he was not a city of Pittsburgh police officer. Okay, he was an East Pittsburgh police officer who was shot in the back 3 times and killed. Now, I would then contrast that with the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. And this is exactly the kind of example that African Americans would sometimes point out, is that you had on the one instance an unarmed 17-year-old boy who was running away from the police, and he was shot and killed. And the other, you had honestly a white supremacist who went into a synagogue and killed 11 people and actually shot 3 police officers, and he was actually taken alive. We could say the same thing for the shooter in the Aurora, Colorado shooting, and so we have this pattern of mass shooters that are taken alive, and people like George Floyd, who, for very, let's say, menial infractions, not that any of them were ever convicted. I mean, we mustn't lose sight of that. But even for perceived menial infractions, and they end up dead. And so there is that difference, that people can often point to. But what we want to really talk about is that we have to be committed to really building police relations. There's some incredible work that's happening here in Pittsburgh on that, and we are so committed to that. Yeah.
We're going to get to that. 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Father Raphael, I'm going to give you a chance to answer that question. Then we're going to go to a caller that we have. So, Father Raphael, what's going through your mind when you're watching the protests? And give us your innermost thoughts, sir.
I can't exactly remember how I saw this video, whether somebody said, oh, you got to go see this one, or if I was scrolling through Twitter or something and saw it. But I do remember exactly seeing this and saying, oh my gosh, this is bad. There's going to be riots, this is this. And you have to understand that I'm a little bit jaded because I've seen so many cases, there's so many legitimate cases, as Father Paul is talking about and alludes to. But there's also been a number of high-profile cases where everybody jumps to conclusions and, riots occur and whatnot. I don't want to mention specific ones because we don't want to get bogged into the details of these other cases. But, in some very recent examples, my opinion was always, let's be patient. Let's wait for all the facts, and let's not do anything until we know exactly what happened here. And in many of those times, I'd been vindicated. But as soon as I saw this video, I go, this is going to be hard for anybody to explain. And as I watched the video several times over, I did not have anything except a real dread in my stomach that, first of all, we're seeing somebody murdered right in front of us, and the look of complacency, pure evil it's been described as, vacancy in the eye, whatever the case may be, that for me it was easy to say this was evil. This guy is taking out somebody's life. Have I ever put my knee on someone's neck? I will tell you, when you are in a fight, and when you are in a fight, any call you go on, there's a man with a gun, because there's a gun on my head, and I'm not the toughest guy in the world. So if somebody starts wrestling and rock and roll with me, you have to take it seriously. And there's been many times when I've gone to make an arrest and I've had pushback in the form of resisting arrest, that I end up getting a knee on the neck, the back, whatever it takes, sitting on them to get them under control till you can get their cuffs behind their back, or the cavalry can rush in and help you. But for anybody to think you could put a knee in someone's neck, especially when there's other police standing around and the situation seems to be in control at that time, and not expect something bad to happen from that. Yeah, I knew right away that this was a case of police, in my opinion. Of course, it's not been found guilty of anything, but of police abuse, and that the result of this would not be good for the city of Minneapolis. Little did I know that was not going to be good for all of us. So,
thanks, Father Raphael.
Yeah,
thank you very much. Appreciate it very much. 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Let's go to our first caller from Alberta, Canada. We have George on the line. George, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Hello. Thank you, fathers, for taking the call and to talk about this subject. Appreciate it.
Thanks for calling.
I have a small introduction and then a solution. Obviously, there is a race issue that's happening between police and African Americans and other visible minorities in America. It's clear, and it's pretty straightforward. Especially that police, they have their own. The law is written in a way where there's always gray zone, and the police can always interpret things from their own preconception But the thing that I want to talk today is I want to know your point of view. Is there is a big piece of the puzzle that nobody in the academic field or government ever speak about, and there's a library of books that speak about it. And basically that's, historically speaking, the first slave that came to North America were white English slaves. They used to be called as indentured servant, but based on numerous books, it shows that they were actually slaves, but they were just used as indentured servant for title. But the way that they were working, the way they were treated, the way they were sold, they were kidnapped, kids, that's way before Irish or African Americans came to North America. They were actually slaves. And then the first African Americans who came, they actually owned white slaves when they had a chance to own one.
George, I'm going to ask you to get either to the point or the question, because we have a lot of topics tonight, and I do appreciate it very much. Let's get to the question. It
seems like the issue is not really a race issue, but more of a class issue between rich and poor, and whoever have the chance to mistreat the other because of money-wise, they will do it. I want to know, what do you think about this piece of the puzzle? And the solution is, if more people know about that, wouldn't that solve the issue that nobody's better than the other, because everybody were enslaved in this country at one point?
Good. Okay, Father Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, needless to say, slavery of any kind is bad for any people. What I would say is unique about the African American experience is that you had really 400 years essentially of slavery, and that it didn't end in slavery. I think one of the things we have to really break through is that when the Civil War ended, America's race problem was solved, and that certainly was not true, because once the slaves in this country were freed, one book I would really strongly recommend, that people read, is Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. And of course, Booker T. Washington was born a slave, and then he experienced freedom, and then goes on to really develop the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And it really chronicles what really the process of freeing the slaves was like. And I will tell you, my opinion is that it really did not go well, especially if we compare to how it was done, in European nations. I think the United States did it poorly. And I think that as a result, we ended up, after Reconstruction, the Civil War ended, we entered Reconstruction in the South. Reconstruction failed, and Jim Crow took hold. And so really we end up with slavery almost taking a very different form. In this kind of systematic oppression of the African American community, at various times in American history, has really devastated the community. So I would agree with the sense that we have absolutely to think about the role that economics has played. We have also at the same time to think about the role that honestly racism has played in limiting economic mobility. Economic mobility in the African American community. I mean, one really powerful example that happened in the Hill District is in 1958. There were many Orthodox Christian families here, and they lived alongside African American families here. Certainly not utopia, but it was a really solid community. And when the area was selected for urban renewal and part of the community was dismantled, whites were paid for their houses, and African Americans, they ended up being placed in housing projects. And this is the whole reality of redlining, this reality that really prohibited African Americans from really building equity, via property. So we have, and then we get into the issue of education, and we see that there is a strong history that goes back of resources going to white schools and resources not going to African American schools. Currently, now we also know that just for example, I'll speak in Pittsburgh, is that if we talk about the role of education in economic upward mobility, we have to understand that, that education plays a critical role. We have also at the same time to acknowledge that schools that are often found in Black communities are underperforming schools. And so we have to really take a look at, does everybody have the same opportunity?
So, Father Paul, you're saying, to George's question, this is a race issue, not necessarily a class issue, or is it?
Well, No, I think it's absolutely both, because I will tell you that honestly, if you go into Appalachia, predominantly, white community where people have suffered immensely. Some parts of West Virginia, some parts of Kentucky, and the list goes on. And we have this extraordinarily profound, white poverty, this extraordinarily profound. The opioid epidemic in some parts of West Virginia, it's the worst in the entire nation. And this has everything to do with economics, and there is a similarity there. I think the one difference is I think that we have a situation in the African American community where there have been historical policies that have addressed this particular population wholesale to prevent this entire population from really gaining that upward mobility. So I do think it's both.
Okay. All right, Father Raphael, obviously you have served in these difficult areas in Buffalo. So do you think this is a systemic race issue? Is it a class issue? Both? What do you think?
I agree with Father Paul that it's both. We had our, and I'm sure Father, there's a good book on what Father Paul is talking about, Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, that talks about the plight of white Appalachians. We had similar neighborhoods up here in the city of Buffalo. So yeah, the problems of poverty and lack of family structure and the missing fathers and drug use and all that stuff, there's equivalence in the white community, obviously. But I do agree with Father Paul that there's this race component, and I've in the last few weeks I've educated myself a lot more on systemic racism. And, while being largely a denier of it for a good part of my life for many different reasons, I would say that I just lost my train of thought on that. Sorry about that.
You were talking about systemic racism and that, for a large part of your life, you denied it.
Yeah. And, I would go into the inner city and do my job as a police officer and deal with the issues that were there and try to do it in a loving, Christian way, and not to be a judgmental person that people bring their own problems or whatsoever. So
right.
I'm looking at things from the ground up, and I'm not privy to the issues that many people are lamenting today as far as redlining. This is totally a new thing to me that I was surprised to learn about, and so it's a problem that affects both races, and the police are in the middle of this in the middle of the night with violence, with violent people, and having to deal with violent people with force, and so a lot of these situations come from that. But at the same time, you have to have your head in the sand to not realize that, as Father Paul said, that we had slavery, and it wasn't like Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and everything was good and over. I have friends who are who are Irish, and I'm part Irish, and who would say that, well, the Irish suffered all kinds of persecution, and they'll you can circulate photos of no Mick apply, and they were given the dirty jobs, this, that, and the other thing, and that's true. We can't deny anybody's suffering. But there's one different component, and that is that an Irish person can clean himself up and get an education and look like an English person, whereas African Americans, they've suffered racism and discrimination because there's a difference in how we look. There's a difference in our skin tone, and so therefore it's easy, if you want to pick somebody to be a scapegoat for your problems, you pick somebody who looks different than yourself. So.
Okay, 1-855-AF Radio. That's 1-855-237-2346. We have another caller on the line, Daniel from New Jersey. Daniel, you are on Ancient Faith Today with Father Paul and Raphael. Welcome.
Thank you, Father. So I just have a quick question. I was wondering, is it sinful not to have compassion or forgiveness for the officer in this who eventually killed Mr. Floyd?
Father Raphael.
Can I jump in first?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Of course, it's sinful. It's sinful when we wish ill to someone else. And it does not end when the person has been bad and treated us poorly, because that's the whole definition of what forgiveness is when we've been treated poorly or we've seen somebody else being treated poorly. And, we are asked by God to forgive as much as we want to be forgiven. Now, that doesn't mean we don't hold people responsible and that there aren't consequences for behavior. There certainly is. But we certainly have to forgive. And, but it's okay to realize and it's okay to say that, well, I have a problem forgiving. A black man who feels like he's been a victim of police brutality or police harassment. It's easy for him to hold a grudge against policemen or white policemen. For police officers who've experienced lots of hatred and people calling them every vile name because they just happen to have a job that puts you in conflict with people most of the time. You are still faced with the problem. You have to forgive others. So yes, I would say it's a sin, even if it's not a pain directed towards you. When you see somebody who's afflicted by pain, the first concern is for the victim, of course. We care about the victim. And then after the victim, then we also care for the soul of the perpetrator, because undoubtedly people are victims in their past anyway. So.
And of course, that doesn't mean that he shouldn't face justice, right?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
All right, Father Paul, what do you think? Should we forgive?
Oh, yeah, I agree with everything that Father Raphael said wholeheartedly. And the only thing that I would add is, and not just in this case, but in every case, forgiveness really is a process. And I think Father Raphael was alluding to this, that when you are wounded, that really, if we're going to work towards forgiveness, we have to recognize the need for our own healing in pursuit of that forgiveness. That the vengeance, that the hate that we harbor for another human, even if they did hurt us or hurt someone we love or hurt somebody that bothered us, if we harbor any hatred or anger for that person, it's an indication that we ourselves are not well. We need to really understand that in order to forgive, we need to bring ourselves to He who is the heavenly physician of souls and bodies, and that by His healing we will attain that forgiveness. We must never lose sight. We have to have a radical commitment to forgiveness, I believe. Absolutely.
And Father Paul, that's kind of at the heart of your ministry, right? When you go into these areas with your response teams, you are often bringing a certain perspective that they don't see coming, right? You're talking about forgiveness, and you're talking about healing and empathy, right?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the thing of it, the reality of that kind of ministry is that whenever you are sitting with a mother, which I've done, moments after her son has been gunned down in front of her own house, her son shot and killed in front of her own house, and I've done that. Now I will tell you that for me in my ministry is not the time to talk about her, that she needs to forgive the man that killed her son. Right. Exactly. We have to really focus on her pain in that moment and minister to her and heal her in that moment. Hopefully that in this ministry, we can help shepherd her to a place where she experiences enough healing mercy, where she begins to foster a desire to forgive. Now, I've seen that happen time and time again. I've seen one woman that underwent such a radical transformation in that pursuit, that she dedicated her life to going into. She wanted to talk to every young man. Her son was shot and killed in front of her house. She wanted to talk to every young man who was locked up for taking a life, because she thought that one day maybe she would come face to face with the boy who killed her son, and she would then be presented with the opportunity to say face to face, "I forgive you," and minister to him, and to her words say, to speak life into dead places. And so it is a process, but it is absolutely possible. I've certainly seen it.
Father Paul, I'm sorry, Father Raphael, you wanted to say something. I apologize.
Yeah,
Did you
well, I
want to
was
add
going to
something?
say that in my conversion to Orthodoxy, I was so struck by the story of Grand Duchess Elizabeth of Moscow, whose husband was killed by an assassin bombing his coach, and her effort to go and to this perpetrator and express her forgiveness and to encourage him to repent of his sins because he was going to be executed for this crime. That's an example for us of that. But as Father Paul said, you're not going to talk to somebody, who's, in the grieving process right there about forgiveness when they've had something, the life of somebody they love robbed from them, or whatever the case may be. It's part of the process, and it's the end goal of what we're all striving for.
Excellent. 1-855-AF radio. That's 1-855-237-2346. We're talking about race relations and police reform with Father Paul Abernathy. And we're also talking with, I've lost my train of thought here. We're talking with Father Raphael Barberg. I'm so sorry. It's going around tonight. Father Raphael Barberg, and we're talking about all of the stuff that's going on the news and around the world. This is the big topic. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to get our minds back in order, and we are going to be right back.
Father Tom will be back in a moment. In the meantime, the lines are open at 855-237-2346. Don't go away.
All These Things, a new podcast from Ancient Faith Radio, in which Hannah Vasquez offers encouragement and inspiration, as well as practical tips, to mothers as they navigate their responsibilities with all these things: homemaking, childcare, food preparation, etc., while trying to stay focused on seeking the kingdom.
Being an Orthodox Christian in this world is hard, and mothering is hard. Combined, it's a lot to navigate and discern. I want to help be a guide for you in your journey toward the kingdom of God. That is the heart behind this podcast.
All These Things, seeking the kingdom of God as an Orthodox Christian mother. Available now on ancientfaith.com/podcasts.
We're back with Ancient Faith Today and Father Tom Soroka. Give us a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Father Tom.
We are back with Father Raphael Barberg and Father Paul Abernathy, and we're talking about race relations and police reform. Gentlemen, let's go on to our next question. Police brutality, right? This is maybe at another issue that is being brought up, not just police brutality in the context of how African Americans are treated, which certainly is a terrible thing, but just the general idea of policing. There's a lot of talk about police reform. There's talk about training police in different ways. So I want to start with Father Raphael. Father Raphael, do we have a policing problem in this country? Is there an issue with police brutality? Are the police being militarized? And maybe what's the purpose of the police? Father Raphael, what do you think?
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Are
back.
You on now?
Sorry about that. I
okay,
hear
good.
You now. I was hearing.
Okay.
The question: is there police brutality and policing problem?
Yeah, basically the question is this. There's a larger question here that has been brought up in the context of all of this, and that is the idea of policing in general. Is there a problem with police brutality? Do they need to be trained differently? Are the police being militarized? Right? That idea is coming up again and again and again. So what are your views on that?
Yeah, those are, of course, the key questions of the moment. And, let me preface this by saying, and it's going to sound like a justification or a cop-out, but it isn't. It's just the starting place, is that you can have the perfect structure, you can have the perfect training, and you could have the perfect screening process for candidates, and you're still going to end up with brutality problems because, number one, policing by nature is a violent job. You are dealing with violent people, and you are.
Father Raphael, I'm losing you. Are you there? Father Raphael, are you there? Father Paul, are you there?
I am.
So while we're trying to get Father Raphael back, how about answering that question? Do we have a police problem? I know you work closely with the police, but is there an issue in terms of police training, in terms of police brutality, militarization? What's your view of this?
Well, I was so interested in Father Raphael's answer, and I appreciate that he was talking about that policing by nature is a violent job. And I think this is what we have to begin talking about policing. We can't talk about policing in America without talking also about violence in America. The United States is a violent country, and I think it's very much a part of who we are. This nation was formed in violence. Even if you look at the issue of slavery, it was resolved with violence. The West was settled with resolved disputes, interpersonal disputes with violence. We resolve international disputes. This is very much a part of American culture. And this happens also to be the context of policing. And so really this idea about policing and the nature of policing in the context of a violent society is something that we as Americans have to take a really deep look at and say, really, who are we? Can we really address this deeper issue of violence in the soul of America? And can we resolve this? Can we heal this issue? Now, then beyond that, from my vantage point, I think one of the challenges that we have when we talk about policing, because in my own experience, in the city of Pittsburgh, we have police, and in my opinion, we have probably some of the most phenomenal. It's probably one of the most phenomenal police departments in the United States. I have nothing but admiration and respect for the Pittsburgh police, and it's not to say that we don't have issues at times, and of course we do. But that's human relations, fallen human relations. What I will then go on to say is that once you go out of the city of Pittsburgh limits, Pittsburgh is in Allegheny County, and then we have, in addition to the Pittsburgh Police Department, we have I think it's 130 additional police departments. Many of them are small. Many of them police officers are part-time. Many of them police officers are making, maybe $10 an hour, $11 an hour. Many of them are not well trained. We part of the issue, I think, with policing, or at least we could take a step, in a positive direction. Some of the the advice that I've heard from some of my friends in the Pittsburgh police in high-ranking positions is that they really advocate for national training, because right now we have 18,000 different police departments in the United States. All of them, many of them have very different training, and so what one police department's standards are is in fact very different from what another police department's standards are. What one police department's approach to community policing is could be very different to another department's approach for community policing. Yeah. This is a time I think for Oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, before we go on to sort of alternative models, I think we have Father Raphael back. Father, are you there?
Yeah, my apologies.
Hi.
I have no idea why my phone.
I'm sorry. I apologize. So everybody, it was really funny because you were talking and like everybody in the chat room went, "No, we want to hear what Father Raphael was saying."
Yeah.
So
we all
I don't know if you can pick up. You were talking. You basically said this, that by its nature, policing is a violent activity, which it's a pretty interesting definition there. So go on from there. Do you feel like there's a problem in the idea of policing as we know it today? Militarization, police brutality, and so forth.
So I don't know if I stressed the point enough, though, that I'm not using that as a justification or a cop-out for bad things that happen to people at the hands of policing.
Right.
I just want us to be realistic and not think that there's some silver bullet, something that if we just do training, if we just screened better, or if we just totally rearrange the whole the way things are run, that things will be fine and we're going to live in some sort of utopia. And if you study the history of the world and policing, which has been with us since men and women have been gathering together in tribes and into towns and whatever, there's always had to be somebody with the job of first of all, taking care of the intruders, those who would come and hurt them from the outside, whether it's your fellow man or wild animals, but then also staying awake through the night to make sure that the fires didn't, burn out and the village burned down, but also because people were drinking, people were fighting, and there were always issues. So from the beginning, the police have been there, and you can call them different things. The Roman authorities were the police force in Judea at the time of our Lord's life.
Right.
And they were rough, violent men, legitimately or illegitimately. That seems to be the nature of the case. So that brings us to to our modern era, and it's interesting that our modern policing was really formed at a time when there previously was a crisis, and this was in the city of London as it grew exponentially in the 19th century, or the 18th, going into the 19th century. And modern policing, as we know it, was founded by the British Home Secretary Robert Peel, largely through his Reform Acts, and I think it's 1828 or 1820 something, which basically, gave us the form of policing today. And I truly think, just like we have people that think we stray from the Constitution, that we have issues in the United States, and of course, as Christians, we feel that when we stray from the Holy Scriptures and the teaching tradition of the church, we're going to have issues. Again, not that anything is perfect, but it's a hypothesis. I wonder if returning to some of the ideals of Robert Peel, which are addressing some of these issues today, and if you'll give me a couple of seconds and indulge me, basically, he gave out nine principles, and the first one, to prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to the repression by military force and severity of legal punishment. I mean, the Brits were very afraid of taking on what they had observed with the French. The French had a very sophisticated police force, but it was tied to the authority of the crown. And it was also, along with, doing what we think of as policing, it was also intelligence for him and a form of repression. And so Sir Robert Peel and the other reformers wanted to make sure that it was something separate and independent. And so they didn't want them wearing military uniforms. They designed a brand new uniform, which today we can kind of recognize, the blue uniform and the helmet of a bobby from Sir Robert Peel. So a lot of, I won't go through all the points, but a lot of the points that he lays out in the Metropolitan Act are things that I think, we should look to and consider today. I mean, cops are like many of us are very traditional. And if something is working and you're used to going in and doing the same thing, you are very hesitant to change. You do not want to change. And my response to these issues when people start calling for police reform, well, number one, not only did I work as a police officer, I worked for 3 years for the state of Maryland as a police instructor. And I see the things that come down every time there's an incident. Oh, we got to have some new training. And it's not effective. It's a joke. Somebody makes a lot of overtime developing this training and going out and doing it. I think that really it's more of a matter of getting back to brass tacks. So that's the militarization. There's two issues with that. Number one, first of all, is it the chicken or the egg? I mean, when I was on the street and at one time we had a gang running around shooting up police precinct houses. Yeah. Did I want a tank to hide in? We didn't even have armored windows in our old precinct house. And yeah, when you're under threat, you want the best equipment you could have. And Father Paul's, a former combat veteran. And so, when you're under fire, you want what you can have. Now, of course, I would want that under fire, but does it set a tone when you go into a neighborhood if you're driving a tank as opposed to, a scooter? Right. And you're, so number one, I would say that, but then number two, Sir Robert Peel's, that was partly what they were trying to avoid in forming a police department. So.
Right. Very good. All right. 1-855-AF radio. That's 1-855-237-2346. We have a caller on the line, Tyler from Louisville. Tyler, welcome to Ancient Faith Today. Tyler from Louisville, are you there? Bobby, we have Tyler on line number 3.
Hello.
Hi, Tyler. Go ahead. You're on Ancient Faith Today.
Hey, I'm a catechumen from a mainline Protestant denomination, and have been really steeped in the idea of differential option poor, that God prefers, loves all people, but pays a special attention to those who are poor and oppressed, and the church and therefore Christians should as well. I was wondering what the Orthodox view on that is, because I hear a lot of people, Christian or not, Orthodox or not, who are saying, well, you got to think about, the police, you got to think about the white people who are accosted by police, and you have to think about everyone equally. And it seems that the Gospels teach against that, and I know in my own tradition it has. So I was just wondering what the Orthodox kind of view on that.
Father Paul, obviously the biblical understanding of the poor is pretty clear. What do we say about the poor and the Orthodox understanding of the poor?
Yeah, well, St. John Chrysostom, is this beautiful quote, the rich exist for the poor, and the poor exist for the salvation of the rich. And I think that very much speaks to, the Orthodox perspective of the poor. And I mean, the thing about what I would say about the Orthodox perspective of the poor is, we really can find this in honestly the heritage of the early church. And I think that what I would say about an unorthodox perspective of the poor is that our commitment to the poor has to be, I think, it has to go really beyond mere words. I think sometimes in this particular context, people can talk about, I support, those who are suffering in poverty. I support the African American community. But it really doesn't go beyond that. But we really contrast that to what the Orthodox Church did, especially in the first 300 years. Not only especially, but just looking at the first 300 years, what they did in the book of Acts, the kind of work they did among the poor, they often did, at risk to their own personal safety, at their own personal health, with great personal cost and great personal sacrifice. So I think if we really look at this and we really challenge ourselves, I'm still struggling to live the gospel of our Lord. I'm struggling to follow this. I think if we challenge ourselves to really embrace this and learn really to look at those who are suffering, those who are poor, and with love and compassion, that becomes incredibly important. I also think that there's a particular, poverty of spirit that we find among people who are also, who might be on the wrong side of history, we might say. I'm always reminded of a quote by Longfellow who said, if I can paraphrase, he said, if we understood the pain in the hearts of our enemies, we would have only compassion for them. So we wonder, how is it that someone could get to a place where they could do something so terrible to another human being? There's probably some pain there. And so this helps us really reflect on how we need to minister to that person, pray for that person as well.
Good.
Father Raphael, what do you say about the poor and our church's understanding of the poor? I think we lost Father Raphael again. Father, are you there?
I'm here. I was on mute. Sorry
okay.
About that.
So what is your understanding of our church's teaching about the poor?
The same as Father Paul. I mean, the quote that comes to my mind is it St. Basil, who says, the excess you have in your pockets, belongs in the stomach of the poor. And so that we obviously have a a high calling to, churches. When churches were built, facing east, facing the kingdom of heaven, and the people would come into church on Sundays. The poor of the city would realize that the people were in a particularly generous move, because another quote, I think it's Chrysostom, who says, "Don't come to church expecting something from God if you're not willing to give what you have to those who need from you as well." So it's our tradition, it's our teaching, and that's what we got to do.
And I think we've ignored it somewhat too much. Sometimes when we are suburban parishes and we've maybe cast off areas that are poor, we forget that there are areas that still need our help. It reminds me of, I've seen a meme going around. I don't know the exact quote, but St. John Chrysostom said, "If you don't find Christ in the face of the poor, you'll never find him in the chalice," which always struck me. And then, of course, St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 8, "You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich." Tyler, any last thoughts before we move on?
Just that I see Christ. One of the things that's drawn to Orthodoxy is that I see Christ's incarnation and his associating of himself with the sheep in the parable of the sheep and the goats. That my God has become oppressed and poor and downtrodden and has related to those folks. And so, to me, that was a huge draw to Orthodoxy. Was just the very idea of incarnation in central. So
great.
Thank you.
Tyler, best wishes on your entrance into the church. Next, we're going to go on to a call from Ohio. Ohio caller, you're on Ancient Faith Today. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. It's hard to formulate my question because I'm a teacher and I teach in I have taught in poverty-stricken areas. And although I'm white, I see it. I see the racism directly, and I've actually gotten fired for standing up against it. I've been chastised. You can't, but I will still continue to fight however I can. And with that in mind, what do you think about some type of more of an outreach? Police do some outreach, but what do you think about more of an outreach with working with kids? Rather than
do you mean the police working?
Yeah.
Do you mean the police working as outreach? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So. I agree with saying no chokehold, like a chokehold ban and things like that we've been talking about, working with the adults. But do you think more of an outreach with students and working with the kids and really getting to know families better that way? Do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Father Paul, you work a lot, obviously, with the Pittsburgh Police, and I'll be interested in getting both of your views of this because, you don't necessarily want to blur the lines with the police either. I mean, they do have to have a position of authority, and so, they can't always be your friend, and there may be kind of a mixing there. But, Father Paul, I'm real interested to hear what you're going to say about this, and then Father Raphael.
Yeah, first of all, God bless you for the many sacrifices you've made in behalf of your brothers and sisters. It's very, very powerful and touching to me. And I will say that I think it's an absolute necessity. We've got to have that kind of outreach with children at the youngest ages so that they really grow up with this relational familiarity with police, this understanding that going back to Robert Peel, that Father Raphael brought up, that the police are the people and the people are the police, that they are us and we are them. We've got to build those relations. One of the things that happens in so many suburban schools is that there are days where honor local heroes and where veterans will come, police will come, EMS will come, firefighters will come. I've seen this. And this becomes an opportunity for these children to really look at them as heroes. Now those types of things, in my experience, do not happen in the inner city. And when I went through some training with some Pittsburgh police, when they were talking, they're actually implicit bias training. One of the things that was really interesting, how they were framing it to police officers, was to really think in terms of a bank, to think about how many deposits versus how many withdrawals. Think about arrests as a withdrawal. If you're making more withdrawals than you're making deposits, you're going to go bankrupt. So really getting police officers to think about, in these communities, how many deposits are you making, so that when it's time to make a withdrawal, you actually have enough capital in the bank to really maintain that authority. And I do think that authority comes in large part from these positive relational experiences. Part of the challenges is when people lose when people lose that relational trust, they also lose their sense of authority for that particular role as well. And so I think it could be very, very beneficial.
Father Raphael, in your experience, were you involved in any outreach programs? Did you have relationships with the people that were in those areas that you were policing? How did that work, and what do you think?
Yeah, for sure. And see, here's part of the problem. With the advent of the automobile, and even in the city of Buffalo, even though they had some cars, there were still foot beats up into the 70s. My boss would always threaten to put me on the beach, and I worked on the waterfront, and he was the outer break wall on Lake Erie. So. But then you add radios to that. The call. So, like I say, a big, not a solution, but a big way to think about this problem is trying to get police officers back into the areas they work in such a way that they have connections with them, and they're not, and less likely to be seeing each other as the enemy. You're on the same team. You want peace. You want justice to prevail. So,
caller, any reactions?
Thank you. Thank you. Do you think that would mean, just out of curiosity, do you think that would mean like forcing police officers, say from inner city, who are allowed to move out to the suburbs, to make them come back to the suburbs? Or
yeah. See, and of course, anything that impinges on our personal freedom, you start to get some pushback. especially when the city is a bad place to live, and you're telling me I have to live with her, my family. I think what they should do is give incentives to help police officers live in the city. In my case, you had to live in the city to get hired, but once you were hired, you could live wherever you wanted to live. Or I think you had to live in an adjoining county or something like that. But I would rather see them, give incentives, for people, try to get some federal program where you help them out with a mortgage to live, in a neighborhood that might benefit from the presence of a police there. But because think about it too, the policeman is going to be raising his family there, and he wants it safe, but is he going to be able to do his job if he's worrying about the safety of his family? So
exactly.
It's not that easy. It's pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for calling.
Thanks for the question.
Appreciate it very much. Next, we have a caller from Ohio, and I apologize. Is it Neda or Nida from Ohio?
Nida.
Nida, thank you, Nida, for calling. Welcome to Ancient Faith Today. What is your comment or question?
My question is I'm also a school teacher in this inner city, and there's a lot of call for moving the police out of the schools and defunding the police. I'm not sure. I have taught mostly middle school. I've been in very violent schools. I've been in very violent situations. I've gotten in the middle of violent interactions with students, and in the heat of the moment, you're just trying to protect people. You're not thinking about the danger. So I guess my question is that the answer? I mean, this is for Father Paul because you work in this arena. Is that really the answer? For me, this is a tough situation, a tough question.
So you're saying don't take the police out of the schools. Is that what you're saying, Nita?
I'm saying is that really the answer? Because I mean, I know students who are happy that the police are there, but then there's other students who have experienced very negative things. And given the situation, when we go back to school, how will they view the police? I'm trying to get a little bit of a different perspective, like maybe what's the Christian perspective,
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah.
Father Paul? Yep.
Yeah, Nita, thank you so much for this question. It's an important question. I would say I would reference my earlier comment about violence, because we can't really talk about this without talking about the wider context of community violence. I mean, this is a real reality, and exactly what you described is true. There are people who, and I will tell you, in the community, even if there is this, on the surface, and it's not really like that here in our community. People, we've worked very hard to cultivate, relationship with the police and respect. It's not that things are perfect, but it's better. But what I would say that even if people have the perception, or like they believe that they got to uphold this attitude that all police are bad to like stay in good standing with their peers, even if that's the perception, deep down there's a lot of people who are really happy when the police show up, because the thing is that it really could be the difference between life or death. So we have to talk really about violence. So what I would say is, what if we look at really how we're I can just speak to how we're addressing violence here in Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh police, they have a strong partnership with community members, and I think this might be some of the conversation that we need to start in this, as it relates to this issue. When we talk about how we're addressing violence in the community, we have a unit here in Pittsburgh called Group Violence Intervention. And there are police officers who are assigned to that unit. There's also civilians that are assigned to that unit. It's actually run by a minister, Reverend Cornell Jones, who's a very close friend of mine, and we work very closely together. And what it really is once police have particular intelligence that there's a particular issue, there's particular violence that might be ready to touch off, there's a whole network of what we call violence interrupters that are actually community members, many of whom are volunteers, some of whom are paid, who then are able to approach the quote unquote bad actors and try to really resolve this issue from a community level, it's very effective. And since we've employed this strategy in the city of Pittsburgh, violence has decreased significantly year by year. What I would say is that if we were to learn anything about this, I think if we're going to talk about having these blind calls for like removing police from schools, I think a better way to really talk about this is to say, listen, our schools are not healthy. They are not healthy, and one of the symptoms of this illness is to say that our schools are also violent places, and that's real. I mean, I've been in some violent schools. I don't have the experience that you have, but I certainly have been in violent schools. We then need to engage the community in that. And there are some very powerful and influential community leaders who really, in partnership with the police, could work to develop a strategy to help quell some of the challenges in that school. And I think that's what we need to work towards. Again, going back to Robert Peel, the police are the people and the people are the police. We need that partnership. I can tell you that every year here, on the 4th of July, except for this year because of COVID-19, there are when they have the big events downtown with the fireworks, there are kids that come here from all over the place, and all kinds of fights ensue. Last year we had two kids that were shot, actually, as a part of that. But we were there. Because we were there. We went down because the police asked us to be there and to support the group violence intervention unit. And so here we were, right? You have all of these community members, side by side, working with police officers, saying to these kids, you got to go home. I remember one of the guys that works with us, who I respect very deeply. He's actually a part of our ministry, our Orthodox ministry. He said to me, "There's my cousin right there. My cousin is acting up." I can tell you, it's a lot better whenever you approach your cousin and say, "Hey, cuz, you need to go home, and you need to go home now." Then and having police officers nearby, so that in the event that things really do get out of hand, there is that ability to have that kind. And so I think we need to be thinking more creatively about police community partnership.
Father Raphael, real quick, your thoughts about police in the schools. Should they be pushed out? Just give us 30 seconds to a minute, because we want to wrap up here. I think we lost him again. Father Raphael, where did you go?
I'm here. Sorry,
is he there?
That.
All right.
Yeah, I'm here. So there's two things with this. It doesn't make any sense at all to me for two things. Number one, I don't know any teachers, and I know lots of teachers, and many of them working in the inner city schools, who would want the police out of their school. That you can't teach if you don't feel safe. And then secondly, what we're just talking about, trying to build relationships with young people and the police, and then, we're just going to take them out of the schools. I don't understand. I need to understand the philosophy behind that better. So.
Yeah. Nita, all I can tell you is I taught an inner city middle school for 5 years, and I can tell you that there is a special place in heaven for you, for all of the work that you do. So hang in there, and God bless you for what you're doing. Gentlemen, we want to ask you one last question, and then we're going to wrap it up. So the killing of George Floyd has ignited, once again, this larger issue of racism in this country. Obviously, we've talked a lot about policing, but we really haven't talked too much about racism. Because we are at the end of our program, what role can the church play in easing the tensions between races that we see in this country? Specifically, what role can the church play? Father Raphael, I'm going to begin with you.
Yeah, and that's, of course, the important thing of why we're even trying to have this program this evening. My brother is my life. I mean, that's the gospel. And who is my neighbor? That's this person made in the image of God next to me. And this is the whole key. Father Paul and I are in complete agreement. We might differ in because of our experiences and our backgrounds in some areas, but we're ministers of the gospel, all three of us here. And Jesus Christ came to save sinners. And he came and gave us an example of something beautiful for us to see. And we love God first, then we can love our neighbor. And if we focus on that, we focus on the worship of God, which is a beautiful experience that transforms our heart, then we can begin to have love in our heart and to begin to reach out towards our neighbor and change the world. It's we in the church have to start there.
Excellent. Father Paul, what role can the church play in easing racial tensions?
Yeah, thank you. And Father Raphael, I so appreciated your comments. And absolutely, he and I are in agreement, just as he says, being ministers of the gospel. And what I would say is that the one thing the United States has lacked, if we look really at what has happened across, in other parts of the world, is that, for example, when the Civil War ended, the slaves were freed and the nation moved on. This is very different than how apartheid ended in South Africa. This is very different than what happened after Rwanda. Someone very recently introduced to me, a colleague that I have that has done some very fascinating work in Northern Ireland after the Troubles. And this is where we have to say that we in this country have never had our American version of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. This is some of the work that came out of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. People were talking about this. King was talking about this, about reconciliation, racial reconciliation. Certainly slaves were freed. The Civil Rights Act was passed, but this work really was never done. I really believe that as Orthodox Christians, we have an opportunity to spearhead this work, just as Christians in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Northern Ireland spearheaded that kind of work after the particular, ethnic or religious conflicts that plagued their nations. We have to be very active in certain, and it does begin at the liturgy, and understanding that as we offer our community up in the liturgy, we are being reconciled to God, and that as we are reconciled to God, we are reconciled to each other in Him. And if we understand this to be true, this liturgy then must pour itself out on our streets. And we must live this liturgy among a process of truth and reconciliation commissions. I very much believe this. In our own communities, learning how to do them, learning how to organize them, learning how to really bring black and white together to see one another as brothers and sisters, and to recognize that we do have issues, we do have a troubled history, but at the same time, we can grow from it together. We can move beyond it together. We can love one another. That radical commitment to love and forgiveness, and the unmoved commitment to take responsibility to the sins of the past. We can be leaders in this, and this can be a way to bear great witness to our Holy Orthodox faith in a time that I believe the Lord is calling us to bear witness.
Yeah, I think that really, I mean, that's another program, really. I'm very curious about, I've wrestled with the whole issue, Father Paul, about, when you see somebody making, in this one particular video that was passed around, some random white girl walking down the street, making her kneel in front of him to apologize for the sins of all white people, it's and this isn't after I've just read Dostoevsky and Father Zosima's that we are responsible for everyone and everything. I really do think that we have to have an honest, good conversation in the church about how do we do this. I mean, obviously, every year before Forgiveness Sunday, we bow before the image of God in the other, and but yet when it feels like it's forced, like I have to take a knee, to atone for the sins of my parents, or I'm racist or something like that. I think we got to have a long talk about this, and I don't have the answer to this at all.
Let's not go down that road. But what I think what we can all agree on is that as Orthodox Christians, Father Paul may be excluded because he is doing yeoman's work in this area, but the Orthodox Church as a whole has done a terrible job of reaching out to the African American community, and that has to change. That really has to change. Gentlemen, I cannot thank you both enough for all of the wisdom and the insight that you brought to us, your experiences. The chat room was on fire. The phones were ringing off the hook, and it was really all due to both of you bringing all of your insight to this problem, which of course we've only scratched the surface of. And so I want to thank you so very, very much for your time. Father Paul Abernathy, thank you so much for all of the work that you do. Father Raphael Barberg, I apologize truly for having that little blip in tripping over your name. I'm really sorry. Thank you so much for all of your ministry and for joining us this evening, gentlemen. Thank you. God bless you both. Before I share some final thoughts, want to express our thanks again to Father Paul and Father Raphael for sharing their experience and insights with us tonight. Thanks also to Bobby for engineering the program, for answering the calls, everybody in the chat room, those who are listening, and those who called in. Whatever our political leanings on tonight's topics, let's be reminded that as Orthodox Christians, we do have the answer for all racial reconciliation and policing issues. The Lord Jesus Christ gives us the church, his body, as the place of reconciliation, not only for God and man, but for man and man, Jew and Greek, male and female, black and white, police and citizen. It's only in the church that our dream of living with one another in peace and love is made true through the gift of the Father by the power of the Holy Spirit. May God enable us to have the vision to share this good news with the world that is now divided against itself. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share on our program after that's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. Join us next Tuesday evening for the next edition of Ancient Faith Today. We'll be continuing our discussion of the state of Orthodox music in America as we're joined by Byzantine music specialist Richard Barrett. Good night, everybody.